And talk about one of the more interesting revolvers in my collection. This is a French 1873 Ordnance Revolver, and this was used by the French as their standard service pistol up until they switched to the 1892 model, which was an 8mm cartridge for the revolver. This revolver used the Cheminot-Delvin principle for the double action, single action mechanism. It used an 11mm cartridge, which is approximately .45 caliber. It was a very short cartridge with a very thin rim, and it used a heeled bullet, which is very similar to our .22 long rifle cartridges now, where the base of the bullet is actually a smaller diameter that fits into the cartridge, and the major diameter of the bullet, which goes through the rifling, is actually wider and the same approximate diameter as the outside of the case. I'll talk about the cartridges in a little bit. This was a sort of state-of-the-art revolver at the time. This used a double action, single action mechanism, where other similar revolvers that were used by other militaries of the time were only single action. If you look at the 1873 German Reichsrevolver and the 1873 Colt single action army, those were still single action designs, where this was a true double action design. This has an ejector rod for ejecting the cartridges and a loading gate, which opens up back toward the grip. This particular model was made in 1888 in the Saint Etienne arsenal in France. It's a very nicely constructed revolver. At that time period, these revolvers were finished in the white. The color that you see here is just patina from surface corrosion over many years. I'll go through a little bit about how you disassemble these revolvers. These revolvers have all the parts are marked with digits for serial number and for disassembly. For the most part, I think those were done so that you could tell which parts went to which revolver, because these were hand fitted for the most part. The revolver has a swiveling lanyard on the butt, and the revolver can be taken apart without tools. So the first thing that you want to notice is that the hammer has sort of a half-cock position. So in this position, when the hammer is down, you can try to rotate the cylinder, and it's going to hit against the firing pin, which is actually protruding through into the chamber. So I'm going to open the loading gate here and give the hammer a half-cock, and now you can see that it rotates freely. When it's in this position, there's nothing to keep the revolver from the cylinder from rotating. So I'm going to give that a little half cock, and then that'll allow the cylinder to rotate. Then I'm going to pull the ejector rod out. So the ejector rod you push forward, it's a fairly stiff spring, and rotate it around, and that clears the ejector rod. So if you were loading or emptying the pistol, you'd get your chamber aligned and then push on the ejector rod. The ejector rod is not spring-loaded to come back, but it is spring-loaded to when you actually close it, so that it stays closed. So the first thing I've done is I've opened the ejector rod little lever there, and I've rotated it down to so it's pointing downward. It's not actually loose. If you have the ejector rod in the way, the cylinder is not going to want to rotate and it won't come out. So I've pulled the ejector rod out and I've rotated it back just a little bit, like you're closing it. And then once you have the hammer on half cock, then you're going to push in on the large button here, and you're going to pull the center pin out. Now you heard that click. That was the ejector rod snapping back in the way again. So I'm going to pull this ejector rod out, and make sure that that's the center pin. I'm going to pull that center pin out. I'm going to make sure that the ejector is not sticking into the chamber, and then the cylinder itself should just come out. And set that there. Now if you notice on the center pin there's a screwdriver blade on that. So we can turn the revolver over and use that little screwdriver blade to loosen the large screw up here on the frame. That's on the left side of the frame. I'm going to turn that and unscrew it. Set that out. Now the frame side plate will sometimes, if it's loose enough, will just pop off. You can see maybe in the video there's a little slot there, so if it's a little tight you could use the little screwdriver blade just to pry it slightly until it comes off. Okay, so I've unscrewed the screw and I've taken that screw out. I pulled the side plate up. So the side plate out, you can see that the side plate inside is quite clean. These revolvers were fitted very, very well, and there wasn't a whole lot of air or corrosion typically that gets on the inside. The grip just pulls off. There's a little flange there and it just lifts off. And see if you can see there, all the little pieces have the serial number of the pistol on them. Okay, so the first thing you're going to need to do is take the tension off of the mainspring. So there's a lever here, and you just push that lever down, and that's what takes the tension off the mainspring. And then we'll be able to lift that out. So I've released the tension on the lever, and then you need to pull the mainspring out. Now the mainspring, there's a little cut under here in the frame. If you have a little screwdriver, in this case I'm going to use the little lip carefully that's on my side plate. Get that down into the little lip and just push back on the mainspring a little, and that just allows the mainspring to pull up and away. And the little hooks there that go under the hammer extension there just come out. So that takes the tension off of the mainspring, and then you can go ahead and proceed to take parts out of the revolver. In this case, one of the things you can do is you can easily take off the trigger guard. Basically, if you get your finger behind the trigger guard and pull it like a trigger, you'll hear it click, and that will pivot down and away off of the frame. So at this point then, you could pull the hand back and get the hammer out. You have to pull the hammer back to get the tension off. Here's the little part that puts tension on the trigger. That little spring can come out. There's a little spring here that works this pivot arm. So you can get a little idea how the mechanism works. These hooks down here are what releases the hammer. So as you pull the hammer back, the hand comes up, rotates the trigger around, catches on this hook. When you pull the trigger, it pivots this arm back away from the notch and allows it to go forward. So if you hold your tension on the trigger there, you can pull the hammer up, off. And that will release the tension, and then you can pull the hand out and pull the trigger up. And the hand is recessed into the trigger. So there's two pieces on here. Sorry. One piece which goes into a slot, and the other piece, which is actually the hand, goes in through the trigger and locks everything together. So that sort of makes a little assembly here. And then the last piece is just the sear. There's a little spring in the frame, and you can pull the sear up and off up and off the frame. So you put that sear back in. Then you can put your trigger back in. We'll do this real time, see if it's actually able to figure this out. So now I've rotated that back around, and the hand is back up into the frame, and I'm holding the sear back. At this point you can put the hammer back into place and see that everything's working as it should. So if you pull it, double action, it should work correctly. Okay, so that's working okay. Then you can put the little spring back here. The spring has a little extension on it that goes into a hole in the frame. And that actually so that little extension there goes into the frame, and this should be sitting underneath that little hook on the hammer. That's what actually puts some tension onto the trigger mechanism. See how the mechanism is working. And then once the trigger guard's back in place, that puts pressure on that spring. So I'll get the trigger guard hooked back in there into the frame, and then give it a push. And it clicks in place, and that starts putting pressure onto the mechanism. Now you can see how the hammer mechanism works there. Okay, so once that's there, and then you can hook these little hooks under the extension on the hammer, and you need to pull back on the mainspring a little bit to get it to sit and hook back onto the frame. Make sure that lever's out of the way. So once the lever's out of the way, this thing goes in really easy. I was trying to put it back with the lever in the wrong spot. So once this lever's out of the way, this just goes in there, and there's a little burr on this little pin here so that the mainspring doesn't slide out. So once it goes in, it's very easy to get it in place, and then you just close the lever, and the mechanism should be back functional again. So double action, single action, working very easy. And you'd set your grip panel in place, hook that little front piece of the side plate in place and push it down. It goes down, there's holes so the pins center in the side plate. Screw the screw back in. Use a little screwdriver extension to make sure it's not going to come loose and fall out. Then I'm going to put I'm going to start the center pin back in. You have to push in on the little button to get that started. You don't want it sticking through the frame yet. And again, I've got this little ejector rod lever rotated a little bit so that the ejector rod isn't sticking through the frame. And then you need to make sure the hammer's back a half of a click. That's why the cylinder wouldn't drop in. Okay, then just need to make sure that the center pin isn't sticking down in the way. That's again why the cylinder wouldn't go in. So now once the center pin is started, then you can just push it. Rotate your ejector rod out of the way. Push it in and that center pin will click in place. And then you can pull your ejector rod back against the spring. Rotate it around till it clicks, close your loading gate, and there's your revolver all back assembled again. So this is the first time I've done this on a video, so I need to remember what I was doing. One comment I did want to make on the ammunition for this. So I do load my own ammunition. It's not that complicated to do. However, there is one note I wanted to make. A lot of these revolvers came into the country, and you'll find them occasionally where people have bored out the cylinder for 45 ACP. Now, there's rumor that the Resistance did this themselves and they fired them this way, but this is a black powder frame, and 45 ACP in pretty much any loading, the pressures are way too high for this revolver. And so I'd stay away from any revolver that's been modified like that. The cylinder should not have any step on the inside. It has a taper, the cylinder chambering. And the best way to tell is if you put a 45 ACP cartridge in there, that's about as far as it'll go. Okay? If it's going any farther than that, somebody's mucked with the chamber, and steer clear of that revolver. Another thing I wanted to touch on is the cylinder throat on these. Now, the cylinder throat on these are they're around .452, so theoretically you could get by with a .452 bullet in the cartridge if you could get it to chamber with that. But I'll talk about what I do to load mine. Again, the original chambering had a heeled bullet, and so you have to buy a special casting mold or buy heeled bullets, particularly to load for this revolver, and I just didn't want to do that. So I've devised a mechanism to load them safely, but using standard 45 ACP bullets. And so I'll show, here's a cartridge that I've made. So this is using brass from Buffalo Arms that's made specifically for this revolver. It's modified from 44 Special. And I'll show you that it drops right in. It's got a very, very skinny rim. You will need a special shell holder for this. So you can see that slips right in. It's flush with the end of the cylinder. Put the cylinder back in. Close that, rotate it around. And I'll set that out of the way. So, in order to load this round, since it was a heeled bullet, if you just seat a 4.52 bullet into this cartridge, number one, it's based on a 44 Special, so the inside diameter is going to be too small for it. So what I've done is I've taken some regular .452 bullets and I've run them through a 446 sizer. I had that sizer for some 41 Mauser ammunition that I was loading. So I run these through a 446 sizer, and what that does is that gets the inside diameter small enough that I can seat this into a case that's been expanded and then crimp the bullet and run it through a sizing die so that it will chamber. If you leave it at .452, it's just too large. So I've sized these to 446, so they're just standard 200, or you can use 185 grain lead semi-wad cutters, H&G 68s. And what I've done on the casing then is I've run a 45 Colt expander die partway into the casing. I don't know if you can tell on here. The casing is a little fatter. You can see that kind of burnished ring. So I've run that sizing die in there, or the expander die in far enough so that I can seat the bullet down to where the base of the bullet is. So I've expanded just far enough to where I can seat the bullet in there. So once I've used the 45 Colt expander, the inside of this case is the perfect size for this 446 bullet, and I can just seat it by hand. And what I do is I seat it by hand just up until the top of the loop groove. Then what I do is I have a 44 basically crimping die, and I run that down, and that crimps or rolls the end of the case into the loop groove. Now, if I tried to put this in my revolver, it would only go in about as far as that 45 Colt or 45 ACP cartridge did. So I need to swage that down again. So what I do is I run this casing now up into a 308 small base rifle sizing die, and what that does is that basically swages or crunches the case and the base of the bullet that's inside the case down to the right diameter to where it now chambers fine in the cylinder. So effectively what I've done is I've made a healed bullet. So I've stuck a regular bullet in here where the base is the same diameter, and then by swaging the case back down again, it's crunching the base of the bullet and the cartridge as well, and squeezing it down small enough to where it'll actually chamber in the revolver. Now you might wonder, you know, that 446, is that going to be a problem for accuracy? This gun shoots extremely well. The rifling is very deep. These bullets are, you know, a normal hardness. They're not super soft. But at 25 yards, two-handed standing, I'm getting to 2 to 3 inch groups shooting the gun. That's not off of a rest. So it shoots extremely well. I'm using a mild load of bullseye powder in this, and it shoots extremely well that way. So that's what I do. It's a little bit of monkeying around, but I don't have to have a special bullet, a healed bullet. And the problem with healed bullets are, once you insert those into the case, then you have to have something to crimp the bullet in. And because the outside of the front of the bullet, bullet is the same side as the casing, you can't just run it up into a normal crimping die, because the crimping ring is going to hit the top of the bullet and it's going to push the bullet down in. So usually what those come with is they have kind of a crimping die that goes like this, that basically comes around the bullet and crimps it into the crimping groove. So I don't have to mess with any of that. So all I did need to do was get the special cases, again, run a 45 Colt expander partway into the casing to expand the mouth, size the bullets down a little bit to 446 so that they would slide in by hand, and then I run them back through a 308 small base sizing die, which just scrunches the case and the base of the bullet. It's not enough to actually change the front of the bullet here. So the front of the bullet is what's actually riding through the rifling, and the base is just slightly smaller. But again, accuracy is really, really quite good out of this gun. So this is a neat, fun pistol. There was an officer's model, which is the 1874, which were blued. They're quite nicely made guns, and the cylinders are scalloped here, where the standard issue model is not. So, hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks.